epicenters like New York City. And as we all know, the pandemic has been especially unforgiving for our communities of color. Minorities have borne the brunt of the health consequences of this terrible virus. We cannot let their businesses also disproportionately bear the economic consequences. According to a survey, a mere 12% of Black and Latino business owners who apply for PPP loans reported receiving what they asked for, and nearly half anticipated being forced to close permanently in the near future. And we don't even know how Asian and Native American business owners fared because demographic data wasn't asked to be voluntarily provided. That is why collecting demographic data on these loans was imperative. I will continue to press to set aside more resources for minority and women-owned businesses, and I hope that we will commit to do more for these businesses in what we are sure to be tough months ahead. I am sure you both can understand many in our country are frightened. They are angry and they are hurting. We are here today to bring transparency and accountability to ensure that America knows they have a government that works as well for them as it does for the well-connected corporations and friends of this administration. As lockdown orders started in March, storefronts were shuttered and waves of layoffs were taking place. In response, Congress provided relief to reeling business owners and their employees. First, Congress established the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, to provide forgivable loans to businesses and nonprofits for mainly covering payroll. Second, to help small businesses that needed financing beyond PPP, Congress enhanced SBA's EIDL program to get more flexible working capital to more business faster. Knowing that small businesses operate on razor-thin margins, Congress created the EIDL grant program to get cash into the hands of small businesses quickly to bridge the gap until their loans are disbursed. Despite the flaws in their implementation, these programs have been a lifeline for millions of entrepreneurs and job creators, injecting over $670 billion into the economy. To address concerns and make the programs work better, our committee held numerous hearings and forums with small businesses, lenders, and leading policy experts over the past few months. One of the top issues we heard from PPP stakeholders is the incomplete and ever-changing guidance. Borrowers testified that they have very little guidance regarding how to spend their loans so they could qualify for full forgiveness. And lenders are still reporting the process for seeking forgiveness is unclear and unworkable. If forgiveness is the centerpiece of the program, a streamlined, efficient process for getting those loans forgiven should be a priority. Turning briefly to EIDL, the lack of clear communication has been an ongoing issue. Given the urgency of this pandemic and the uncertainty for so many small businesses, SBA must do a better job communicating. As the spread of COVID-19 has accelerated in recent weeks and lockdown orders return, it will be extremely important that we take lessons learned since March to stave off unnecessary bankruptcies and make sure these programs are working for America's small firms. We also need to explore other ways SBA can support our small business sector, like turning to tried and true program enhancement that work after the Great Recession. Once again, thank you for being here today. I now yield to Ranking Member Chabot for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Administrator Carranza as well as Secretary Mnuchin for being with us here today and taking time out of your very busy schedule. So thank you so much for being here, both of you. While we all agree we must be forward-looking as we continue to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, the topic of today's discussion is equally important. We must continue to work together to ensure the federal government's relief efforts face sound and prudent oversight. These programs were developed to assist the nation's smallest firms. Instances where ineligible businesses and entities, including political organizations who benefited from the programs, must be examined closely. Take, for example, the over $300,000 taxpayer-backed loans that were received by the Ohio Democratic Party in May. And Madam Chair, for the record, I would oppose such a bailout for the Republican Party as well, but it happened to be the Democratic Party in Ohio that took advantage of this, and I don't think it was ever intended for that type of thing to happen. Additionally, oversight of how well the billions of dollars allocated to assist small businesses was utilized is imperative. That will help us to formulate a future strategy and to make well-informed decisions that benefit the greatest number of Americans. I happen to represent most of the city of Cincinnati. For the past few months, I visited with countless small businesses and obviously many of their employees as well. And I and my staff have spoken with representatives from the Cincinnati African American Chamber of Commerce and the Urban League. Some of our smallest businesses, particularly those in minority and economically disadvantaged communities, oftentimes the smallest businesses and typically under 10 employees, they didn't, when this started, and many of them still don't, they didn't have the strongest relationship with banks or credit unions when they were seeking these loans. So I think that it's something that we, and I know as this has evolved, and the chair has been instrumental in that effort as well, and we've worked with her and her staff on that. But we have to make sure that those folks in these economically disadvantaged areas have access to this, because as I say, oftentimes the relationship they've had with the banking institutions, financial institutions, just isn't there. So it makes it even tougher for them. Now, it's impossible to legislate from Washington for every single situation across the country. Likewise, it's impossible to regulate from Washington for every scenario that may come up. All of the folks in this room recognize this and have been reminded since March of that structural impossibility. Congress acted quickly earlier this spring. Speed was paramount in getting funds into the hands of small business owners to keep them afloat when they were forced to shut down through no fault of their own. Consolidating 6 months of legislative work in a little more than 6 days, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats working together, and it was signed into law by President Trump on March 27th. This more than $2 trillion economic relief package delivered on our commitment to do everything possible to protect the American people from the public health and economic impacts of COVID-19. The CARES Act created the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP. Following passage of this landmark legislation, the SBA and the Department of the Treasury worked tirelessly to execute the law and issue regulations to inform borrowers and lenders alike how the program would be administered. To the credit of everyone involved, the first loans flowed from private lenders 7 days, just 1 week later on April 3rd. Since that date, the PPP program has distributed nearly 5 million loans to small firms in the amount of over $500 billion. In my district and the surrounding area alone, small businesses utilized the program to preserve nearly 500,000 jobs. These successes cannot be ignored, and Ohio isn't alone. This program provided small businesses and their workers a lifeline across the entire nation. Were there bumps in the road? Of course. As I stated earlier, it's very difficult to get a program this size up and running in a week. Have there been communication issues between the federal government and the lenders and the borrowers? Undoubtedly. But that is one of the reasons why we're here today. We must examine and learn from the past and prepare for the future. Unfortunately, there are still challenges that are presenting obstacles for the nation's smallest firms. Because we continue to face this threat, we must be forward-thinking. More needs to be done, and we have proven that when we work together, across the aisle, across the Capitol, and across the different ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, we can move mountains. We aren't done yet, and I look forward to engaging with you, Madam Administrator, and you, Mr. Secretary, as well as you, Madam Chair, as we continue to work for American small businesses. I want to thank you both for being here, and again, thank the Chair for holding this hearing today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot. I'd like to take a moment to explain how this hearing will proceed. Each witnesses will have 5 minutes to provide a statement, and each committee member will have 5 minutes for questions. Please ensure that your microphone is on when you begin speaking and that you return to mute when finished. With that, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is the Honorable Jovita Carranza, Administrator of the SBA. Administrator Carranza has an inspiring background. Born in Illinois to an immigrant family from Mexico, she began her career at UPS as a part-time employee, ultimately climbing the corporate ranks to become president of Latin America and Caribbean operations. In 2006, President Bush named her Deputy Administrator for the Small Business Administration, and most recently was the Treasury of the United States. Welcome back to our committee, Administrator Carranza. Our second witness is the Honorable Stephen Mnuchin, the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury. Mr. Mnuchin has a successful career as a banker at Goldman Sachs for multiple decades before leaving to join other hedge funds throughout the 2000s. He was appointed Treasury Secretary by President Trump, where he has served for the last 3 years. Welcome to the House Small Business Committee, and thank you for joining us today, Mr. Mnuchin. Administrator Carranza, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you.
The mic is not on?
It says green and talk.
Okay. Maybe bring closer to you. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Now.
Okay, now.
Right.
Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, and members of the committee for the invitation to testify this morning. I'm eager to update you on the progress that has been made by the agency in helping small business weather the coronavirus pandemic. Since March, the SBA has processed more loan volume than it has in the entire 67-year history of the agency. As of this morning, the PPP has approved nearly 5 million loans for over $518 billion in much-needed fiscal relief to America's small businesses. We administered this first-of-its-kind program with an eye toward equity, recognizing that this pandemic has been particularly harmful to socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. We mobilized thousands of new lenders, including community banks, credit unions, fintech companies, farm credit lenders, and hundreds of CDFIs and MDIs that specialize in providing liquidity to underrepresented communities. Through economic injury disaster loans and EIDL advances, the agency has reached over 8 million small businesses, dispersing nearly $170 billion in assistance. That amount is more than all other disasters combined in the history of the agency. EIDL loans are currently being processed in just 5 days, with disbursements occurring in just 2 days. These programs help the small business sector survive once-in-a-lifetime disruption. Since early June, I've made a concerted effort to personally speak to businesses left reeling by this pandemic and to financial institutions so that I can see for myself what is working and where improvements need to be made. One of the scores of business I visited was an African-American logistics management firm in Dallas. SBA loans provided him with a bridge, a financial bridge, over the most tumultuous waters he's ever experienced. It helped him not only keep his employees on payroll, but also hire new workers who received comprehensive skills training and professional certifications. Many small business owners use that term, bridge, to describe how SBA loans provided them with time and the space needed to rethink, innovate, and to adapt their business models for success in this new environment. One African-American manufacturer in Greensboro, North Carolina, told me that an SBA loan helped her develop brand new lines of revenue online. SBA loans helped a whiskey distiller in Traverse City, Michigan, transition his manufacturing operation to hand sanitizer to meet both a social need and financial gaps. This pandemic has been an impetus for innovation in the small business sector. But, Chairwoman, it also has accelerated modernization at the SBA. For example, we've created an internal oversight plan for each CARES Act program, and we've looked long-term at our management responsibilities for millions of businesses and disaster loans. The agency has brought on thousands of staff to support our COVID disaster operations while simultaneously servicing 175 natural disaster declarations. We've significantly corrected the customer service experience for idle applicants by accelerating processing of our loan queue, helping them to better plan. Our dedicated SBA professionals have been working hard to achieve this largely on telework status, and as a result, we are more nimble, more responsive, and better prepared for tomorrow. Before I conclude, I want to say a few words about the PPP data disclosure made earlier this month. The data reflects information about loans approved by lenders and entered into the SBA loan system by those lenders. It does not mean that SBA has determined that a borrower has complied with program rules or is eligible to receive a loan and forgiveness. We are reviewing all loans. Moreover, we have provided the opportunity for business or lenders who believe that their reported information is inaccurate to contact us, and we will work with them to fix it. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that this unprecedented program has emerged as one of the most successful and consequential federal economic response efforts in history. That success is the result of a collaborative effort that includes the White House, Treasury, SBA, the lending community, chambers of commerce, and importantly, each and every one of you. I know that there is more work to be done, and we all share the same goal of helping small businesses across the country. I look forward to working with this committee and other members of Congress. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Carranza. Mr. Secretary Mnuchin, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, and members of the committee, I am pleased to join you today to discuss how the Department of Treasury and the SBA are working together to provide relief to business and their workers through the PPP. We remain committed to working together until every American gets back to work as quickly as possible. America's economy continues to recover from the challenges posed by COVID-19. For the second month in a row, the jobs report vastly exceeded forecasts with a record of nearly 5 million jobs. This brings the 2-month gain to approximately 8 million jobs. While unemployment rate is still historically high, we are seeing additional signs and conditions of improvement. The Blue Chip report is forecasting that our GDP will grow by 18% in the third quarter. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reports that 79% of small businesses are at least partially open, and half the remaining businesses will open soon. Retail sales rose by 18% in May and by 7.5% in June. But let me point out, June was actually 1.1% higher than the same June 2019. This is a result of all of our programs working with Congress. Investors and businesses have historically high cash positions and are beginning to put them back to work. We are in a strong position to recover because the Trump administration worked with Congress to pass legislation on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis and provide liquidity to workers and markets in record time. In particular, the PPP is keeping tens of millions of employees in their jobs. Economic impact payments are helping millions of families. We are monitoring economic conditions closely. Certain industries, such as construction, are recovering quickly, while retail and travel are facing longer-term prospects. We are sensitive to the fact that certain areas of the country are experiencing increased numbers of cases. The task force working with state and local officials is helping to ensure that people can work safely in this environment. We look forward to continued conversations with this committee and other members of Congress to address these critical issues. Turning to the PPP, the SBA and Treasury worked together to launch this in unprecedented time. We approved over 5 million loans for $517 billion to support the employment of over 50 million jobs. This is truly an extraordinary achievement, and we are pleased that the loans were broadly distributed and made across diverse areas of the economy, with 27% of the funds going to low and moderate income communities, which is consistent with the proportion of the percentage of the population. As you might expect, with a program of this magnitude executed on a national scale rapidly, we initially experienced some complications. We resolved them quickly. To implement the program, our teams work with members of Congress on a bipartisan basis to issue rules and guidance to provide clarity. By standing up the program quickly, we were able to support tens of millions of jobs. We have worked closely with members of Congress in both parties to pass 3 subsequent pieces of critical legislation. We also reached a second round of funding for over $300 billion. I look forward to these continued bipartisan efforts. A next phase of relief should extend the PPP, but on a more targeted basis for smaller companies and those that are especially hard hit, such as restaurants, hotels, and other travel and hospitality business. The Treasury Department is implementing the CARES Act with transparency and accountability. We've released a significant amount of information on our website, reporting on usaspending.gov and updates to Congress. We are cooperating with various oversight bodies. Regarding the PPP, Treasury and SBA regularly released data. On programs, the Treasury and IRS have made data information regarding millions of economic impact payments available on their website and to the GAO. We are pleased that the Treasury, working with the Federal Reserve, has announced to add to existing disclosure on the liquidity facilities by posting additional information on the website. Chairman Pell and I have had productive discussions with the members of the Congressional Oversight Commission. In addition to the PPP, we had 160 million payments for the economic impact payments. We've made massive amounts to support air carriers. We've had $150 billion to Coronavirus Relief Fund. The Federal Reserve facility is up and running. I'm pleased to announce that Main Street made its first loan for $12.3 million to doctors' offices consisting of 15 practices in Wisconsin. The lender was Starion Bank, a family-owned $1.2 billion community bank. There's a $50 million construction loan, which will save over 3,000 jobs in the working. I look forward to working with Congress next week on a bipartisan basis to pass additional legislation. I'd like to thank the members of this committee for working with us to help the American people, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Secretary Mnuchin, ethics rules were waived administratively in the PPP, allowing friends of the Trump administration to get access without any further review. Meanwhile, there are thousands of small businesses, many owned by women or minorities, and located in rural areas that were desperately seeking assistance. Were you concerned about those optics?
Well, let me just say, as it relates to certain loans that the administrator said, there will clearly be loans that are reviewed for appropriateness. But let me just comment on the conflict of interest rules. I had very specific discussions with Senator Schumer and McConnell on the conflicts rules, and it relates to the direct loans from Treasury and the loans from the Federal Reserve. There were very specific requirements and certifications that were required from members of Congress and the administration. As it relates to the SBA program, Congress could have included those same requirements but decided not to do so. And indeed, the SBA followed their standard provisions for the SBA. The SBA Standards Conduct Commission determined that the PPP loans should be governed by similar disaster programs. And explicitly, and again, this was a committee that did not consist of political people, explicitly decided to provide the same waivers that they've done for other programs. So again, we look forward to working with oversight committees to make sure that proper rules and regulations were followed.
Well, I welcome that, and we intend to exert our responsibility and our constitutional duty to be at the table. I am the first minority female chairing a committee. And when we are discussing lending programs that are within the jurisdiction of this committee, I will demand for the ranking member and myself to be at the table. I insisted that ethics rule should not be waived. These are lending programs. If it's good for the 7A and 504 and SBIC, it should be good for this type of lending. And I will insist on that when we sit down to discuss going forward. I understand idols were capped at $150,000 in an effort to stretch the funding. However, I asked you, Administrator, the appropriators asked you, and the Senate asked you on numerous occasions if you needed additional funding, and the answer was not. Yet, here we are, and it is our small businesses that are suffering. Moving forward, you must work with us, and I ask that you remove the cap for new item loans immediately and allow those with existing loans to obtain the capital they deserve. You still have $200 billion of loan-making authority left in the EIDL program, while small businesses are hurting. So help us help you, because members of this committee and businesses who came to testify before this committee, they said that they might remain open, but will not be able to keep those businesses open, because when they were thinking that they would apply for the maximum allowable loans, then you reduce to $150,000. We need to do better than that. This is not going away, and too many businesses are suffering. Mr. Mnuchin, the pandemic has caused the rate of Black-owned businesses to drop by an astonishing 41%, and the rate for Latino-owned businesses by 32%. These numbers are unacceptable and are only going to get worse unless we act now. Amid reports, shouldn't we set aside a percentage of the remaining funds for small businesses that need it most? I just heard you saying that you are going to ask for hotel, restaurant, the traveling industry. What about minority businesses?
I agree with you. There should be a set aside for small minority businesses.
Thank you. Thank you. So I can count on your support that we could set aside funding for mission-based lenders, because, you know, we are discussing here the smaller of the small businesses who have no connection, who has no pre-existing banking relationships with those financial institutions. Those who have relationships are mission-based, like CDFI, like MDI, like micro lenders. And I hope that we could, going forward, work with you on that issue. My time has expired, and now I recognize Ranking Member Steve Chabot.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Carranza, I'll go to you first. Given the overwhelming response to this emergency, is the SBA prepared to respond to other disasters such as floods and hurricanes and fires? We know they're coming at some point. Are you all prepared for that?
Yes, Mr. Chabot. At this point, we have about 3 type disaster declarations that are being submitted by the governors. It's either economic disruption based on civil unrest, or it's natural disaster, and then, of course, the March declaration of economic disaster. So we're processing all 3 as we speak.
Very good. Thank you. Secretary Mnuchin, I'll move to you next. Does the loan forgiveness process need to be simplified anymore? For example, I know there's some members of Congress that have suggested perhaps even forgiving all the loans under $150,000, for example. I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't do that, but I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts about it. I've heard a lot of concerns from folks out there about how complicated the forgiveness process can be. If you could talk a little about that.
Well, we look forward to working with this committee and the Senate Small Business Committee to simplify the process. There were provisions in the existing act that made it complicated. We tried to issue as much guidance as we could. I know one of the things we'll talk about is, should we just have forgiveness for all the small loans? I think that's something we should consider. We should obviously make sure there's some fraud protection, but we look forward to working with this committee and others. Thank you.
As you know, at this point, there's approximately $130 billion that's still in the PPP program. So everyone's talking about, so what do we do with that? Do we reduce the number of employees eligible from, say, 500 down to 100, or do we stick with what we have? Do we do a second PPP? And I know these are negotiations that everyone is having now, including the administration, the House, the Senate, this committee, and others. What are your current thoughts about that?
The administration supports using the existing money and topping it up with some additional money, and that will be discussed, and allowing for a second payment to the businesses that are especially hard hit. And Chairwoman, let me just say, I was only giving examples of businesses. I didn't mean to any way imply that those are the only businesses that are hard hit. I think this time we need to have a revenue test and make sure that money is going to businesses that have significant revenue declines. That's something that Congress didn't have in the first provision. But make sure that the businesses that are especially hard hit, particularly small businesses, and put in certain safeguards. So some of the types of people we saw that took out loans, and I look forward to working with Congress. If Congress wants to put back in the conflict rules, we're more than happy to work with Congress. The administration supports, we will participate on the same basis of the House and the Senate.
And let me, Secretary Mnuchin, also one of the things that you all were operating under impossible time constraints. We passed this. I was at the signing ceremony on a Friday. The next week, the loans were literally going out the door, although not that many, and it wasn't glitch-free. We all know that, but you all got your act together pretty quickly and saved a whole lot of businesses all across the country, and God bless you all for doing that. And this committee was involved in it, many others as well. But I know one of the things that was frustrating, and again, I don't want to be critical here, but was frustrating, I heard this from lenders, I heard this from small business folks, I heard it from our staff, was just the time it took to get the guidance out so people knew what the rules were, what we were all operating under. Do you have any thoughts for the future as to what we might be able to do with
Sure. Well, let me say, in one of the more ridiculous statements I've ever made, I committed we get the program up in 2 weeks. And working with the SBA and the staffs, we were able to do that. Now, obviously, in doing that, it ran into a lot of issues, but we made the judgment. It was more important to get it up and running quickly, that sending money to people 4 months later wasn't going to help small businesses. Now that we have it up and running, especially to the extent there are minor changes to the PPP and the EIDL programs, working with the SBA, we can get the guidance out very quickly. We won't have the technology problems we had last time. And again, I would encourage this committee to work in the context of these programs and put more restraints. The other thing I think you should consider on the EIDL is, now that we have Main Street open for loans above $250,000, that we really do focus EIDL on loans that are $250,000 and below.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Finkenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you holding this hearing. And so just for the Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary Carranza, for you guys to understand, the district that I represent is in Northeast Iowa. It has 3 bigger city centers, and the rest is pretty rural. And our district has been hit very hard on a number of levels, whether it's been the attacks on our agricultural community over the last few years, or now this pandemic and how it has affected not just our cities, but also our rural areas as well. And one of the things I want to touch on, Secretary Mnuchin, I know you brought this up, but really want to dive into this are those economic impact payments. Those direct assistant payments that are important for individuals who are worried about how are they going to pay their mortgage, their rent, put food on the table, but also for our local businesses as well who have been able to stay open to have some sort of economic stimulus here during this pandemic. And one of the things that I was really concerned about is when these went out to folks, obviously if they had their direct deposit set up, those went into their account, most of them. However, we heard from 700 people within my district about these payments who did not receive them, or they received them, but they were in the debit cards and didn't realize that they were these economic impact payments. And so why was this set up the way that it was? Why was there no real communication out to these districts, out to folks who needed to understand how these were coming out? And then also, I know we wrote you a letter, actually, Secretary Mnuchin, about the fees and reissuing these cards because so many folks were throwing them away. I'm glad you listened and decided to waive that $750 charge for replacing, but why does it cost $17 to priority ship these cards to folks? Why do taxpayers who need their money now have to wait longer and it costs them more? This is just something, again, that needs to be dealt with, and I'm glad you fixed a piece of it. But what are we going to do down the road when hopefully we issue more support to folks and actually have that education? And why was this done in the first place?
Well, thank you for your comments. And let me just say, the fact that there were 700 of those in your community is inexcusable. And if you have specific issues, we're happy to follow up. I would say the IRS and Fiscal Services did an extraordinary job in sending out over 150 million, again, in a record period of time. The debit cards, you did point out something. We didn't realize that the debit cards were sent in unmarked envelopes. We will correct that going forward. I do think the debit cards actually was an interesting addition for two reasons. One, it allowed us to get payments out quicker since we could only create so many checks. And two, going forward, debit cards.
I'm sorry, Secretary Mnuchin. How long did we have to wait to put those out because the president decided to have his name on those checks or on the paperwork that went out with those?
I can assure you there was zero delay associated with either one of those issues. It had no impact on the timing. We were limited in the number of checks we could print per week, but that had no impact on it. And I think the fees were waived. If the fees weren't waived and you have constituents that still have issues, again, I'm happy to follow up on that.
Yeah, the fee of $750 to replace was waived, but then there's the $17 that cost for the priority shipping of the cards.
You let me know and we'll follow up. That should be waived as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And then I also have a question about the PPP program. Obviously, this has been incredibly important all over the country and in districts like mine. But I have to be honest, I was really disappointed at the beginning when this rolled out. I mean, we allocate these dollars and then they go to these agencies. So they go to SBA, they go to Treasury to set up how these are doled out. And communities like mine, quite frankly, were left behind because we have the highest concentration of community-based financial institutions in the entire country within my district. And so the first batch essentially went to big banks and people who were connected with their banks and left out communities like mine. Did either of you think about how this would impact our folks who lend with community-based financial institutions? Why was this done the way that it was at the very beginning? And how can we ensure, I know we have that set aside now for those dollars, but how can we ensure that as we continue to look at this, that we are doing what we should here with these agencies to make sure we don't forget about rural areas? I mean, on the SBA, I understand as well that we lost the head of rural affairs during this. Actually, she got moved. I know we're short on staffing to deal with this, but not the time to move somebody that represents rural areas.
Time has expired. If you wish to answer the question, sir.
I can assure you we are very focused in making sure that the community banks and the CDFIs have equal access, and you're correct. Unfortunately, there were issues in the beginning. We corrected it very quickly.
Thank you. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for being here today. My first question is for the Administrator. Thank you again for being here today, Administrator. I greatly appreciate your leadership through this pandemic. I would also like to convey to you that your local office in my district, Columbus, Ohio, SBA, has been a phenomenal partner and resource for me. We have been doing a back-to-business tour for the last 3 weeks. Everett Woodell from your office has been with me along the way, and his team, and we're very grateful. And to see the business owners that encounter the SBA while we're there and to put a face with the name is very pleasing for them as well. So thank you. An issue that I've heard more and more about from my constituents is the lack of clarity on PPP forgiveness. Specifically, I hear this often from business owners looking to have their businesses bought out. This could be because of the pandemic or a planned sale prior to COVID-19 that's been placed on hold because of the virus. In this situation, the business owner took PPP in order to support their employees, and now they cannot sell their business with this forgivable loan on the books. Why is this?
Thank you, Congressman. This is a situation that I'd have to speak with you personally or and address the particular case, because this is news to me about them taking a PPP and then wanting to sell. It's not a new incident where small businesses that are ready to sell because they don't care to go through another pandemic or another crisis. They're in a position and interested in selling their company, but the PPP or the idle loan issue was not raised when we had those discussions. But I have experience similar to you that there are businesses that are ready to sell. But I'd have to look into, and I'll concur with the Treasury on how to manage that situation where, in the forgiveness, we haven't addressed that at this point. Okay. An entity wanting to sell their firm and they have a loan.
We will work with you on that.
Yes.
In the business, one, for example, that I've been in communication with, they were doing an exchange in January before the pandemic hit. So this is, most of them that I've been in contact with have been having this issue before the pandemic even started. So we will work with your office and address that. Thank you very much.
Look forward to it.
Mr. Mnuchin, thank you. My next question is for you. I've introduced legislation with my colleague from across the aisle, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, that would provide a tax credit for small businesses to purchase and install PPE and related safety equipment. This legislation would help small businesses that are suffering financially under the weight of mandatory closures be able to afford the personal protective equipment required to reopen their doors. Are you open to working with myself and Ms. Lawrence to ensure our small businesses are safely prepared to welcome customers again?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not familiar with the specific legislation, but I like the concept a lot.
Appreciate it. It's up to $25,000 tax credit, so thank you. Look forward to that. Administrator, back to you. If a business owner decides to use personal finances, monies that's not associated with their business, to pay off their PPP loan in order to move forward with the sale of business, they just have to eat this as a loss? And again, that may be something that you and I may need to sit and discuss.
Yes, I agree. I have to understand all the nuances to that particular situation.
Understand.
And also perhaps there's other businesses that may be facing the same thing that we need to look into.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mr. Secretary, my last question is for you. I greatly appreciate your leadership. I mean, it's been fascinating to watch you. As we look towards the next aid package, much of the focus seems to be on providing aids to schools, hospitals, and first responders. I support these efforts, but also believe we must continue consideration of America's economic engine, small business. And I know that Madam Chair and Ranking Member Shabbat have both talked about this. What types of considerations for small businesses and workforce development efforts are also being considered? And I didn't leave you much time, Mr. Secretary.
Various items, but again, I think that's something that should be considered, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I yield back my remaining time.
The gentleman yields back. Now we recognize the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Mnuchin, I have a question that I'd like to raise with you, but first I just wanted to point out, as you were talking in your opening statement about extending the PPP program, but perhaps trying to target the assistance to businesses that need that help the most, as well as maybe learning from some of the lessons along the ways as we've worked on the PPP program together. I want to encourage you to look at the Restart Act introduced in the Senate by Senators Bennett and Young, and here in the House by myself. This bill builds upon the PPP program. It models itself after that. But I think importantly, it has some provisions in there that would target the aid to businesses that can demonstrate that they have in fact suffered revenue losses over the past several months related to coronavirus and the economic impact. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Restart Act, but I would encourage you to give it a look as you're looking to improve upon whatever it is that we do next to assist businesses here in the United States as we shift into a recovery phase.
I am familiar with it, and I think parts of it should be incorporated.
Thank you for that. I look forward to working with you and with the senators and House members on something similar to PPP and the program proposed in Restart. I wanted to raise an issue with you on behalf of critical access care hospitals, including some in my district. Are you familiar with critical access hospitals?
A little bit.
Yep. Federally defined as providing important healthcare access in rural areas, in rural communities, where these are hospitals that are going to operate under very thin margins and struggle financially, but it's important the federal government recognizes how important they are to access to care. In addition to access to healthcare, they're often the largest employers in a rural region, and therefore are just critically important. Now, your department has, I think, rightly looked at organizations applying for PPP who are undergoing bankruptcy as ineligible. I understand why you would do that under normal circumstances, but there are a number of critical care hospitals in the nation who are undergoing Chapter 11 restructurings. And given the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic and a recession, and that these hospitals have a very unique federally recognized mission and are providing important access to healthcare in areas where it's going to be hard, even in good times, to be making money. These are really like nonprofit hospital organizations. I was wondering if you would consider reconsidering eligibility for critical care hospitals undergoing Chapter 11 restructurings for the remaining PPP funding that you have. To date, they've been excluded, and you can imagine during this pandemic and the recession, the fact that they couldn't do certain types of services that they normally would be doing. They're really struggling, and several of them are at risk of closing, which would be a terrible loss for these communities.
I'm very sympathetic to those types of hospitals, and we look forward to working with you and considering that.
Well, I appreciate that very much. As you know, the Treasury and SBA have been able to make some changes in the program for eligibility for organizations to include some nonprofit hospitals that are tax exempt under Section 115 and hospitals owned by state or local government, as well as others. But I think that those jobs obviously very important in rural communities, but even more important is ensuring the access to care is preserved. And they have been applying for PPP. They were rejected. In some instances, some of these hospitals have gone to courts who essentially have said that the determinations made by the Treasury and SBA would have to be changed, or Congress would have to act. So I don't know if you think that you need some kind of legislative action, or if you think that you have the authority you do to look at this and make that change yourself. But I want to thank you for working with both my office, but also Senator King and Senator Collins from Maine, and I'm sure other senators who represent similar hospitals in a similar situation are eager to work with you to try and help these hospitals.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Chabot, Mr. Secretary, Administrator, thank you both for being here in person for this. This is unprecedented times. Mr. Secretary, our office has dealt with many people who have waited weeks and weeks for their unemployment checks to get approved at the state level, hundreds of thousands across the country, I'm sure. As you may remember, we discussed this on a phone call over 4 months ago where we noted that under the current capacity, states were ill-equipped to handle the influx of unemployment applications. To combat this problem and to keep hardworking Americans employed, Congress worked in a bipartisan way, unprecedented actually in today's times, to establish the Paycheck Protection Program. And while I believe this program could have been expanded and more could have been done to help the 40 million Americans who are currently unemployed, this program has successfully saved 51 million jobs in America, which was designed so that when we come out of this pandemic that we can quickly stand up the economy, which is what we've been seeing happen in May and June and continue to see that happen now. You have stated many times that the priority of the PPP was to predominantly preserve and save jobs and employees rather than the business owners themselves. Would you still agree with that statement?
Yes.
Additionally, could you discuss what you've learned from this or strategies that the federal government can implement in the future to better prepare for this next situation or this situation in the future?
Well, let me just comment on one of the things we liked about the PPP was all the money we were spending on the employment side of this was money we saved on unemployment. I think one of the issues we've learned and we have to fix in the next legislation is the technical issue where in certain cases states with the top up were paying people more not to work than to work. And as you said, some of the states were better prepared. Some of these states are 40-year-old computers. I also want to just say one thing. I know a lot of people use this 40 million people unemployed. Fortunately, it's not 40 million unemployed. People thought we'd get to that. But fortunately, right now, we only have 18 million unemployed, and we have about 14 million more than where we started this, and we got to get those people back to work. But thank you.
Thank you. Further, my casework team has worked with hundreds of people who have had difficulties receiving their stimulus check, and I know you're aware of this. We've talked to your offices. Can you briefly explain, very briefly, what we've seen happen and why? Is there a big issue here, or are all these one-offs?
I mean, let me just say, all these one-offs, I'm sympathetic because these are real people who want their checks, so I don't mean to any way minimize this. But again, we sent out over 150 million checks in record time. And yes, there were certain cases because they were either done off of previous tax returns or other information that we got, and that's unacceptable, but we'll work with you on it.
Thank you. Administrator Carranza, 2 weeks ago, Associate Administrator Rivera testified before the committee regarding the EIDL program. And during my conversation with the administrator, he committed to providing this committee with a document outlining some best practices by the end of the third quarter, September 30th, 2020. This will be a document to explain what the SBA has learned and how you all believe you could better be prepared in the future should another pandemic arise. Just as a side note in that, the administrator had stated he'd been here since 9/11. He'd been through 9/11, the financial crisis, and you know, we keep reinventing the wheel, and it seems with all of us engaged in this in a very bipartisan way that we could put a pandemic playbook in place so that we could learn from our mistakes and not repeat them again, because when we make mistakes, people are harmed or are not at least given stimulus when they need it. So if we could learn from those mistakes and do better, that would be great, and I think that would be a way to do it in a non-political way that we could put these on the shelf. One of the key components of this document would be to design a communication plan for future pandemics, which would greatly help all of us work together. Would you commit to seeing that get done by the end of the third quarter?
Yes, Congressman. We've already begun. We've prepared the first deck on how we're addressing fraud. We have also staffed up. I've started with 2 additional executives, SESs and ODA, so we're going to reinforce the leadership in ODA for future situations and in preparation for the end of the year. So definitely you'll have a full SOP or MOP.
Well,
Unless
again,
you've learned.
as business people, and
Yes.
many are in this room, I've been in business 35 years, you know, we can talk about what happened, but that doesn't really solve a problem. So if we can endeal in a document what those issues were so that we can not make those again, we'll make new ones, and that's human nature. But if we can get that done, that would be great for us. And Madam Chair, Ranking Member, I thank you for allowing us to have this meeting, and it's very important. And thank both of you for being here and for what you've done in these unprecedented times. Thank you.
Look forward to continue working with you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired, so now we recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kim, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for convening this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for showing up. Secretary Mnuchin, I wanted to start with you. You rightfully noted in your testimony that small businesses are continuing to face a dire circumstance right now. Even those that have received Paycheck Protection Program loans are telling me that they're unsure whether or not they're going to be able to survive. And there are a lot of concerns about just the bigger state of our economy and whether or not our economy is going to be able to pursue through these coming months. And if not, is that going to have a negative impact on our small businesses? In my home state in New Jersey, we've gone through a really tough time over the last couple months, and we face a tough challenge up ahead when it comes to our state economy. It's been crippled, and we have dramatically hampered our recovery, especially for small businesses. And these are not just about COVID-related expenses, it's about loss of revenue that could very well create widespread layoffs, decrease consumer spending, weaken our investment in our communities. Secretary, I wanted to ask you if you would commit to working with Congress to ensure that we have the necessary funding to our states and local municipalities to solve the crisis that we face and create a strong economic recovery.
Well, I think, as you know, we allocated significant amounts of money to COVID-related expenses. We've tried to issue guidance to be very clear that money can be used for law enforcement, first responders, and others. I think the issue of lost revenues is a much more complicated issue, and the issue of taxing authorities between the state and the federal government. But we will be working with Congress on this.
Well, I raise this because, you know, I've heard you talk about before what could potentially come next with state and local funding on this. And I think it's really important and central to this discussion that we're going to be having over the coming weeks about this. When I've heard you talk about it before, you've previously described this money as bailouts for some states. And so I just want to hear from you a little bit more on that front. I believe that for you, perhaps it's that you don't want to see this funding go into states that you characterize as mismanaging funds because you don't think that would be fair, that it wouldn't be fair to other states that are working hard on their economy and their budget, so why have them cover for other states? Is that sort of a correct interpretation of your assessment?
Well, what I have said, and I agree with this, that if there were financial conditions that states had coming into this, it's not the federal government's role to bail them out of that. Now, we have through Main Street, through the Fed facilities, we have provided lending facilities to the states and municipalities. But the issue of taxing authority, the federal government has taxing authority and the states have taxing authority. So where there are lost revenues, I think there is a fairness issue of how those get allocated across the country.
Well, I agree with you that there's a fairness issue here at stake. And in New Jersey, our state only gets back somewhere around 75 cents to 81 cents for every dollar that we put into the federal government. It's one of the lowest in the nation. Other states get back well over $1, some $2. Kentucky gets back about $2.35 last I saw. So I guess I'd ask you, is that fair? Is that fair to the residents of New Jersey?
Yeah, well, let me just say, I've lived in New York and California, and both New York and California cite those numbers as well. I don't believe that is an appropriate number because the answer is more rich people live in those states, and because of the way we have taxes and the rich people are the ones who pay the preponderance of federal taxes, I don't believe the calculation as a result is the right way to look at things.
Okay, well that's helpful for me to understand how you're approaching this problem, and I want to continue to work with you on that because from my standpoint, if New Jersey is often calculating that we give into the federal government about $20 billion more than what we get back every year, I think there is an issue of fairness here, and I really don't want us in the middle of a pandemic to get to a situation where we're trying to pit states against each other. We saw that with personal protective equipment, and now with funding. I think there's a chance for us to really come together here and try to think about this, especially when we know that current and former Fed chairs all have said and reportedly warned that economic recovery could be hampered if we do not appropriate more aid to state and localities. Just switching gears here at the very end, Administrator Carranza, I understand that the economic injury disaster loans were capped at $150,000 to ensure all borrowers could access the funds. However, this policy shortchanged many businesses. So I wanted to ask you, moving forward, will you commit to removing this cap for new EIDLs and to allow the existing loans to obtain more funding in Phase 2?
Congressman, what our experience is currently is that the average loan has dropped from 63 to 57,000 down to about 37,000 since we've opened in July, excuse me. And so at this point, the operating expenses that people apply for are not hitting the cap in great numbers. About 1% of the applicants are pursuing that amount. 80% of the loans that we have processed come in significantly under the 150,000. But I will continue assessing it. We're reviewing that on a daily basis, Congressman. So I look forward to working with your office.
Thank you.
Would you yield? If there's any time to,
Thank you.
well, we are over time. But I expect for you to lift that cap, especially when there are other states that are facing now the pandemic. You cannot predict if any business from those states will need more than 150,000. So the fact that now from those other states, you're not getting those type of applications or that type of amount doesn't mean that that will apply to every other. Businesses should have the opportunity to be able to apply for over 150,000 if that is what they need.
Congresswoman, at this time, since we opened up the portal, we have an additional 5 million applications. We have probably about 15 to 20 days remaining with the remaining funds. So if I keep that level of 150, I will be able to service 5 more million small businesses.
But from the beginning, appropriators, myself included, Senator Cardin, and some of the senators asked you if you needed more than what we included in the bill. And you said yes. So come to us. Tell us when we ask if that is enough.
Yes, I will work with your office.
Thank you. And now we recognize the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you,
Mr.
thank
Stauber.
you, Chair Velasquez and Ranking Member
Oh.
Shabbat. I also want to thank the 2 witnesses for being here today. So Secretary Carranza, this kind of follows what the chairwoman just talked about. I'd first like to share with you some concerns that I've heard from my constituents, and it seems that the SBA has taken some liberties to reduce the cap of loans given out from 2 million to 150,000. Well, this is likely to ensure the maximum number of businesses receive some sort of funding during this crisis. My constituents are rightfully upset. They feel that they are being cheated out of what they were promised by their government. I heard from your colleague, Mr. Rivera, on this issue a couple of weeks ago, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond today.
Yes, Congressman. I also receive emails where their calculation on operating expenses may have not reached the 150,000, and we have taken those under special reconsideration and looked at ways where we could increase that amount. Secondly, to exceed the 150,000 at this given time would be premature because we have 5 million applications currently. As I stated to the chairwoman, if there are needs for funds, then we will bring that up for discussion. What we do with the applicants that need more fund is we counsel them that there is the PPP program also that's a forgiveness loan, and we provide technical assistance. We don't influence, nor do we recommend. We just share that there's also another option that they can consider. We don't take lightly the fact that businesses are in need of funds. It's an emergency lifeline that we initially thought this pandemic was going to be 2 weeks, and now it's a couple of months. And so we recognize the fact that they are in need of greater funds.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. You know, as I've said before, the SBA and the Treasury were given a nearly impossible task. And while there have been some bumps in the road, we appreciate the work that you, Secretary Carranza and Secretary Mnuchin, and your respective teams have put into helping the small businesses across this nation during this pandemic. My last question will go to Secretary Mnuchin. You know, shifting gears a little bit, I've been hearing from local grocery stores and convenience stores of the coin shortage. What are your thoughts for addressing this issue, and